So this is our second video about the aqueous humor. In the last video, we have discussed about the production of the aqueous humor from the ciliary body. As you know that we can link with the last video, this is ciliary processes, and there are two epithelium on the ciliary body. The first one is called the pigmented epithelium and the second one is called the non-pigmented epithelium. So all these stuff which are coming out, which are secreting from the ciliary body, is actually coming from the non-pigmented, coming through the non-pigmented epithelium of the ciliary body, right? So you remember the sodium ion which has a positive charge, then the chloride ion will come out, will follow the positive charge, and osmolarity will increase over here, and then the water will release to balance this osmolarity. And you know that the composition of the aqueous humor is like this has the most important factor, which is ascorbic acid, lactate, glucose. All this stuff is actually the composition of the aqueous humor. And you know that the aqueous humor is actually for the nutrition of the optical structures of the eyeball, like cornea, like the crystalline lens. So now we will discuss about the circulation of the aqueous humor. As you know that the aqueous humor is actually coming from the non-pigmented epithelium of the ciliary body. And you know that about the different chambers of the eyeball. First, we will discuss about the chambers of the eyeball to make it easy. As you know that this is the optical structures, the first transparent optical structure of the eyeball, which is called the cornea, right? And this cornea has 43 diopters of the power, right? This is not the topic actually. So the distance between, or you can say the chamber between the posterior surface of the cornea and anterior surface of this colorful structure of the eyeball, which is called the iris, this chamber is called the anterior chamber, right? And this chamber is actually shallower than the posterior chamber. And what is the posterior chamber actually? The posterior chamber is the chamber between the posterior surface of the colorful structure of the eyeball, which is called the iris, and this optical structure, which is called the biconvex structure, which is called the crystalline lens. So this is called the chamber between the posterior surface of the iris and anterior surface of the lens. This is called the posterior chamber, right? And the last chamber, which is called the vitreous chamber, which is starting from the posterior surface of the lens and it covers all the area to the retina. This all area is in the vitreous chamber. So there are three different chambers of the eyeball which we have discussed. So from where the aqueous humor will produced actually from the posterior chamber, because the ciliary body is in the posterior chamber, and ciliary body is actually the factor which is producing the aqueous humor. So aqueous humor will release over here in the posterior chamber, and after filling the posterior chamber, it will move in the next room, and that is called the anterior chamber, and it will shift from the posterior chamber towards the anterior chamber through the movable diaphragm, which is called the pupil, right? So from the pupil, through the pupil, the aqueous humor will travel in the anterior chamber between the cornea and the iris. So we have reached, the aqueous humor has reached in the anterior chamber, and now this is called the circulation actually of the aqueous humor. And now we will move to the drainage of the aqueous humor. So the point here are some important landmarks, some important factors, some important terminologies which we have discussed in our last video as well. So the point where the cornea and the sclera and the iris are meeting together, this is called the anterior chamber angle. So now we will discuss about the anterior chamber and the anterior chamber angle, because the aqueous humor will drain into the different structures through the anterior chamber angle. And this is called, there are two different pathways of the outflow of the aqueous humor. The first pathway is called the Irredo corneal pathway, right? And the second one we will discuss later, The first is called the iridocorneal angle, and now we will learn about the anterior chamber and the anterior chamber angle. So before learning about the anterior chamber and anterior chamber angle, we have to learn about some important factors, some important landmarks, right? And the first one is called, you know that this is the anterior-most transparent structure, which is called the cornea, right? And this structure is called the sclera. So the transition point between the cornea, which is transparent, and the sclera, which is opaque, the transition point, the junction between these two surfaces anteriorly, this is called the corneo-scleral junction, or yes, the limbus. But I'm talking about the anterior, right? Anteriorly, if you can see in my eye, the transition point between the transparent structure cornea and this whitish of the eye, which is sclera, the transition point between these two structures anteriorly is called the limbus or the corneo-scleral junction, right? And if we come posterior to this, at the point of the limbus, right here, this indentation, this groove, this depression is called the scleral sulcus. The scleral sulcus, and right. And if we come posterior to the scleral sulcus, in the sclera, there are group of fibers which are present of the 80% of the you can say collagen fibers, and approximately 5 to 7% of the elastic fibers, elastic tissues. This group of cells is called the scleral spur. Here you can say in the red marker, posterior to the scleral sulcus, in the sclera, there are group of fibers, and these group of fibers are called the scleral spur. And there is important function of this scleral spur, which is this scleral spur will give attachment to the longitudinal fibers of the ciliaris muscles, right? We have discussed about the different fibers of the ciliaris muscles in the last video. So this scleral spur, which is actually the group of fibers, will give attachment to the longitudinal fibers of the ciliaris muscle, which are actually attached with the crystalline lens. And these fibers, these longitudinal fibers, are actually helpful in the outflow of the aqueous humor, right? So now we will discuss about the different landmarks about the anterior chamber angle and anterior chamber. Now we will discuss about the anterior chamber angle. So the anterior chamber angle is actually the combination of the different structures. The different structures, the different important structures will meet at a specific angle, and that angle is called the anterior chamber angle. Now let's discuss. As you know that this is the first anterior most transparent structure, which is called the cornea, right? And an important anatomical line, the first structures will make the anterior chamber angle, which is the part of the anterior chamber angle, that is called the Schwab's line. What is called? The Schwab's line. The Schwab's line is actually the anatomical line which is at the termination point of the fourth layer of the cornea, which is called the decimus membrane. So at the termination point of the decimus membrane, which is the fourth layer of the cornea, you know it, that anatomical line is called the Schwab's line. So actually the Schwab's line is the part of the cornea, right? I can repeat, the anatomical line which is at the termination point of the decimus membrane of the cornea, that anatomical line is called the Schwab's line, right? So it means the first structures of the anterior chamber angle is part of the cornea, which is called the Schwab's line. So the first is called the Schwab's line, which is actually the part of the cornea. And now we will discuss about the second structures of the anterior chamber angle. So the second structure which is most important, and that is called the trabecular meshwork, right? And the trabecular meshwork we will discuss about. This is trabecular meshwork, actually we will go later. The trabecular meshwork is actually the channels, the group of channels through which the aqueous humor will drain out, right? So I can make a smaller trabecular meshwork over here. I must say that I should go with 3 different markers to make the trabecular meshwork. So these 3 different structures, which is actually the group of channels through which the aqueous humor, which is actually coming from the ciliary body, passes through the pupil and travel into the anterior chamber, and in the anterior chamber there are 3 different group of channels which is called the trabecular meshwork, and then aqueous humor will go in the trabecular meshwork and will travel in further structures, right? So we have discussed about the 2 different structures of the anterior chamber angle. The first one is called the Schwab's line of the cornea, and the second one is called the trabecular meshwork. Trabecular meshwork, this is the second structures, and now we will discuss about the third structure, and that is called, yes, the scleral spur. We have discussed about the scleral spur in last few minutes, right? The scleral spur, which is actually, you remember the group of fibers, elastic, and yes, that is called the scleral spur, and the scleral spur was actually gives attachment of the longitudinal fibers of the ciliaris muscle, you remember. So the third structure is called the scleral spur, and if I am saying that scleral spur, it means the scleral spur is part of the sclera, right? So we have involved the third structures which is part of the sclera and which is called the scleral spur, the group of fibers in the sclera which is called the scleral spur, which gives the attachment of the longitudinal muscles of the ciliaris muscle, which is actually helpful for the outflow of the aqueous humor. So the third structure is called the scleral spur. So we have involved cornea, trabecular meshwork, which is part of the anterior chamber actually, and the third structure which is the the sclera. And the fourth one is called the fourth structure, which is very important, the last structure but not the least structure, and that is called the iris root, the root of the iris and the anterior part of the ciliary body. I can write it for you. The fourth structure is called the iris root and ciliary body, yes, but the anterior part of the ciliary body. So finally the Schwab's line of the cornea, the trabecular meshwork which is part of the anterior chamber, the scleral spur which is part of the sclera, and finally the iris root and the ciliary body. These all structures are meeting together at a specific angle, and combinedly they make a specific angle which is called the anterior chamber angle. Hope you understand about the anterior chamber angle, and this anterior chamber is the specified point from the aqueous humor will drain out from the anterior chamber, right? So this pathway, there are 2 different pathways regarding the outflow of the, or you can say the drainage of the aqueous humor. The first pathway is called Irredo corneal angle, or you can say the irido corneal pathway, because this is iris and this is cornea. So actually the drainage, the trabecular meshwork is between these 2 structures, actually the cornea and the iris. You can say this is trabecular meshwork which is in the anterior chamber, and this trabecular meshwork is between the iris and the cornea. So the first pathway for the drainage of the aqueous humor is iridocorneal pathway, right? And now we will learn the anatomy of and the little bit physiology of the trabecular meshwork. So here it is, our trabecular meshwork, and now let's learn about it. And now we will learn about the trabecular meshwork. We will discuss a little bit anatomy and physiology of the trabecular meshwork. So as you can see, this is trabecular meshwork. There are 3 different types of the trabecular meshwork. The first one is called the Uvl meshwork. right? In the figure you can see all these stuff in the blue marker. This is called the uveal meshwork. And why this is called the uveal meshwork? Because posterior to it there is iris, right? And because it is attached with the iris, posterior to it there is iris. As you know that if you remember, I said that the trabecular meshwork is between the cornea and the iris. So if we start from the posterior, so here it is iris, and anterior to it there is trabecular meshwork in the anterior chamber. So after the iris there is trabecular meshwork, right? So this blue marker, this portion within which is in the blue marker, this is called the uveal meshwork. And why it is called uveal meshwork? Because it attached with the anterior uvea. And what is anterior uvea? The iris, right? So that's why these structures are called, these thin cord like structures are called the uveal meshwork. And these are thin cord like structures which are arranged in a radial fashion, as you can see here. So these structures are called the uveal meshwork, right? So if we move further, if we move anterior, these structure which is in the red marker, these are called the corneoscleral meshwork. And why this is called the corneoscleral meshwork? Because they are attached with the cornea and sclera. Because I have repeated again and again that the trabecular meshwork is between the iris and the cornea. So posterior there is uveal meshwork, and anterior to it there is corneoscleral meshwork, which is in the red marker. And these are thin perforated structures which are smaller in size as compared to the uveal meshwork. So these structures are called the corneoscleral meshwork, and they are arranged in a laminar fashion, as you can see here. So next to this, next to the corneoscleral meshwork, there are structures in the green marker, and these structures are called the juxtacanalicular meshwork, right? So these structures in the green marker, these are called the juxtacanalicular meshwork, right? And they are also called the cribriform. I can write their names. The structure which is in the blue marker, these are called the uveal meshwork, and the red marker, these are called, which is in the red marker, these are called corneoscleral meshwork. I think my markers are getting tired. Corneoscleral meshwork, and the last one, these are called, I can write it here, juxtacanalicular meshwork. So these are called juxtacanalicular. These red markers are called, the red structures are called the corneoscleral meshwork, and these blue structures, the structures which are in the blue marker, are called the uveal meshwork. So the aqueous humor, you know it, are drained through these structures, through these trabecular meshwork. So first of all, it will go in the yes, the uveal meshwork. You see, these are thin cord like structures. So from there the aqueous humor will travel in the uveal meshwork, and then it will move, as you know, as you see, these are openings of the corneoscleral meshwork. So from the uveal meshwork they will travel into the corneoscleral meshwork, and then from traveling from these structures, from these openings, these are openings of the corneoscleral meshwork, and it will move into the last step of the trabecular meshwork, and that are called the the juxtacanalicular meshwork. And these juxtacanalicular meshwork are also called cribriform meshwork. Why this is called the cribriform? You remember the lamina cribrosa? And the lamina cribrosa was the perforated area of the sclera, which is the thinnest part of the sclera from which different nerves and arteries will travel, right? So why this is called the lamina cribrosa? Because they have perforations. So these area which is called the juxtacanalicular has perforations. This is perforated area, so that's why this is called the juxtacanalicular area is also called the cribriform meshwork. So from the cribriform meshwork, or you can say from the juxtacanalicular area, the aqueous humor will drain into the very important structures, a canal which is called the Canal of Slam. The Canal of Slam is actually a 360-degree tube, which is, if this is the eyeball, if I can show it here, if this is the eyeball, actually the Canal of Slam is 360-degree. It is placed 360-degree like the trabecular meshwork as well. So this is 360-degree tube is called the Canal of Slam, which is the second structures after the trabecular meshwork, which is most important for the drainage of the aqueous humor. This is called the Canal of Slam. I can write the Canal of Slam. This is called the Canal of Slam, which is in the black marker. So after rushing in the Canal of Slam, there is an other structures which is welcoming the aqueous humor, and these structures are called the collector channels, right? So collector channels are the channels which are meeting with, which are junctioning with the Canal of Slam, right? So this is the final structures of the drainage of the aqueous humor, and these are called collector channels, right? So these are called collector channels. These channels are called, these tubes like structures are called the collector channels, and from the collector channels our aqueous humor will drain further into two different pathways. And the first one is called, actually these are the sclera, the veins of the sclera, the episcleral veins. So the collector channels from the start, this is called the Uvl Meshwork, then we will go in the Corneal Meshwork, and then we will travel to the juxtacanalicular or cribriform meshwork, and then through these channels we travel into the Canal of Slam, and from the Canal of Slam there are different collector channels in the sclera, and these are called collector channels. And from the collector channels there are two different veins which will welcome our aqueous humor. So first channel is called this vein, and second one is called this vein. So what are the names of these veins? This is called the episcleral vein, and the second, the subconjunctival vein. So there are two different veins. The first one is called the episcleral vein, and the second one is called the subconjunctival vein. So our aqueous humor will travel from Canal of Slam through collector channels, and it will travel into the episcleral vein directly, and from posteriorly it will travel into the subconjunctival vein. So here we go, there are two different pathways, and from the episcleral vein it will travel into a different structure which is called the cavernous sinus, and from the cavernous sinus the aqueous humor will drain into two different veins, like the first one is called superior ophthalmic vein, and the second one is called the anterior ciliary vein. And from here the aqueous humor will become the part of the blood, and it will again recycled from the plasma of the blood from the ciliary body in the posterior chamber, right? And now this portion from Canal of Slam, collector channels, and the subconjunctival vein, and subconjunctival vein will go into the different veins, and the first vein is called the superior ophthalmic vein, and then in the facial vein. So these two blood vessels, these two veins will make the aqueous humor the part of the blood, and then blood will take into the the ciliary body, and the ciliary body will again produce the aqueous humor production, right? And now hope this is clear. And yes, now we will discuss about an important clinical you can say a feature of the aqueous humor production, which is related to the glaucoma. So in the last few minutes of this video, we will learn about the different clinical features of the clinical important points of this lecture, right? As you can see, this is the colorful structure of the eyeball, which is called the iris, and the anterior most transparent structure is cornea, and this biconvex structure, which is a biconvex structure, is called the crystalline lens, right? Now we will discuss about the synechiae, the anterior synechiae and posterior synechiae, right? I hope you know it. If this colorful structure, which is called the iris, if stick together with the crystalline lens, this is called the posterior synechiae, right? If the crystalline lens and the iris will stick together, this condition, this clinical condition is called the posterior synechiae, right? And if the colorful structure, which is called the iris, if it is stick together with the anterior most transparent structure, which is called the cornea, and this is called the anterior synechiae. So in both of these conditions, the angle would be closed. Suppose if iris and cornea will come together and stick together, the production of the aqueous humor will compromised, and the angle would be closed. And if iris and the cornea will come together, then the drainage would be impossible. So here the production will disturb, and from here, if anterior synechiae, the drainage would be disturbed. So in both the conditions, the angle is closed. So this is called angle closure glaucoma. So both, due to the closure of these angles, the intraocular pressure of the eyeball will raised. So due to the elevation of the intraocular pressure, the patient would be in suspect of the angle closure glaucoma, right? And what is open angle glaucoma? Open angle glaucoma is if the angle is open, there is nothing to do with the angle is totally open from the both side. So there is blockage in trabecular meshwork, which is here in the anterior chamber, or the collector channels, or the canal of Slam. So if the blockage or impurities are there in the trabecular meshwork or canal of Slam or collector channels, so intraocular pressure, so the drainage of the you can say trabecular meshwork will be compromised, and that raise of the intraocular pressure will be suspect of the open angle glaucoma. So that was all about the aqueous humor, the production, the circulation, and the drainage. See you in the next video.